Okay, so I guess we're back with another podcast, another Story in Life podcast with Dale and David. And today we've got Stevan Mirkovich with us. Pastor Steve. What do you prefer, Steven?
Steve. Steven, Steve, Mirk. All of the above, I'll answer to.
We don't pay him enough to be Mirk, so bad jokes. I can't believe I said that. Anyways, we're talking about open theism. And since Steve knows much more about that than we do, we asked him to share a bit of that.
Yeah, open theism is a fun topic. And it's kind of had a little bit of a rebirth here, a renaissance in the last 30 years or so. But yeah, open theism is kind of still in a state of flux, right? There's not really a standard definition when you ask people what is open theism. But there's definitely some obviously commonly held beliefs amongst people that would call themselves open theist. But really, Adventism's kind of in a unique position because our very own Richard Rice, professor at Loma Linda, wrote a book back in 1984 called The Openness of God. And that's where the phrase open theism or openness came from. And Richard Rice is a professor at Loma Linda, as I mentioned. I think I'm being a little redundant here, but I wrote this small book, 100 pages, just exploring these sorts of questions. And so what are those questions, really, I guess is what we're talking about here today. Yeah. Open theism is also known by another language, another language, please edit that out. It's known as, in other sectors, other people have called it relational theology. Okay. So that's another title by which it goes, and I actually quite like it because I think relational theology, it's less nebulous. Mm-hmm. Open, what do we mean? What do we mean by open theism, right? But really, it's this idea of reciprocity. It's this idea of being in genuine give and take relationship. And that's what openness and relational theology has. Now, it's got all kinds of philosophical underpinnings, things that have forced people to think that direction. And the number one issue that has generally, if somebody calls themselves an open theist, the number one issue that they've spent a lot of time thinking about is the issue of theodicy, which, very basically defined is God just? In the light of pain, suffering, and evil being present, can we rightly call God just? And how do we deal with this struggle in light of classical notions of God, right? So classical notions, these omni words that we all kind of throw around,
we avoid.
Omnipresent, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, right? Omniscience being maybe perhaps a key idea in open theism.
The big bully in the sky, as Joss Whedon calls him.
yeah, exactly. Is God a bully?
Yeah.
So relational theology, open theology, finds its access point, its center point, along this notion that God is in a genuine relationship with those people that he has created. And so, the rest of what open theism, we'll just get the elephant out of the room. The thing that people hate the most about it is that, it claims that God does not know the end from the beginning exhaustively. What open theists would term exhaustive definitive foreknowledge, EDF for short. Does God have exhaustive definitive foreknowledge? And because open theists have questioned this point, and philosophically, theologically, biblically, on a lot of different planes, they've brought that assumption into question, then they get branded as heretics, or they get branded as people that, are messing with the definition of God and these sorts of things. But really, open theism and that element, that part that really drives people nuts, that maybe God doesn't know the future exhaustively. Everything else that open theism brings to the table gets, overlooked. And I guess that's my biggest pet peeve is that, why does it always have to kind of boil down to this question of exhaustive definitive foreknowledge? There's so much else, like prayer, for example. We can talk about that as an example of how prayer becomes a lot more intelligible in light of a relational God or an open God.
Yeah, that was actually my question on that. What do you mean by relational? Can you expand on that a little bit? To say God is relational, I think most people would say, well, yeah, of course God's relational, but you obviously mean something very particular by that that's different.
So it's this notion of freedom and will that comes into play when we talk about relationships, and the notion of, or perhaps what some would say, the appearance of freedom that isn't really there, etc. So when we say relational, we say that there are actually genuinely free moral agents that have been given freedom, and that this freedom is by definition irrevocable. In order for it to remain freedom, it must be irrevocable. That doesn't mean it's infinite. It's finite in that you can use your freedom to put something at an end, like your own life, but the irrevocability of freedom becomes this premise upon which we build our philosophical case for relationship, right? So that's what we mean by relational God, that he's in a genuine give and take relationship. For example, we would be very comfortable as open theists to say God's will can be thwarted. Whereas traditional notions of God's sovereignty is that's ludicrous to say that God's will can be thwarted. God's will is absolute. God always gets what he wants. And we would say, no, I don't think, we would say that's not true in Scripture, and it doesn't really pass the test in just everyday observation of life. Or at least it shouldn't if we define God as loving.
Well, I got a bunch of questions.
Yeah, go for it. Anywhere you want to go with it.
I guess something, when I was reading a bit on this to try and have some thoughts before we got into the discussion, maybe have some questions, I ran across a statement by Greg Boyd, who's, from what I understand, fairly well known as an open theist. And that was something he said, and so I liked where you started. He said, what's at stake isn't as much about EDF as it is the idea that, God is engaged with us, and it is a give and take, and we have an impact on God. And I really like that. EDF is always where it goes, but you can debate for that forever, but it's about that point that we're in a relationship, and God is changed by relating to us. I mean,
just take the classic notion of a Christian at camp. Like we're sitting here in a camp, and people always like, how's your relationship with Jesus? Yeah. Well, how do we render that intelligible? What does that actually mean, to have a relationship with Jesus? Well, the only thing I can kind of relate it to is the kinds of relationships I have. I have friends, I have a wife, I have kids, I have a mom, and these are all relationships where we actually interact. And there is, if I hit my son, I actually hit him. Not that I hit my kid, I'm just giving you an example of if I steal money from my mother's purse as an 8-year-old kid to go buy candy at the store, that actually happened, and I had the freedom. I had the freedom to do that. Like, what I mean is, in that my choice, it was my choice. It wasn't some sort of weird.
Omniscient being about Legos.
What about Legos?
If you'd been really good, you would about Legos instead.
Yeah, I mean,
Matchbox cars.
Thanks.
Yeah, this relationality, and Greg Boyd, it really isn't. We're not so much defining God's foreknowledge or God's omniscience. We would still say God is omniscient. God knows everything. But we would say philosophically that the future is by definition contingent. It's full of possibility, and God knows it as such. God knows it as such, knows it for what it really is, still in the future, full of possibility. For example, God has no idea what I'm going to eat for supper tonight because I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, I may get invited out to somebody's place to eat, or that person actually may not cross my path because this podcast may take a little longer. But if it ends a little faster, then maybe I cross somebody's path and say, hey, we were really meaning, Pastor, for you to come over and have dinner with us. And then I have to make the decision, am I going to eat at home or am I going to eat with this person? And even if I do eat at home, what am I going to eat? I have no idea what my wife is preparing to plan to eat today. Does she actually have the freedom to choose? Do I have the freedom to choose? Or is it predetermined by and by, in this sort of a blueprint that for sure at 5:30 tonight I'm eating at my cabin?
Well, and this is a goofy question, but this is what I hear from a lot of people, is whether you look at whether that's written or not, but from an open theist perspective, does God have a plan then where you're going to eat and what food you're going to eat?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a trivial question, but...
yeah, does God have a plan? So I think...
and on those little details, like, I mean, yes, I mean, we can talk about that later if we need to, but, does God care where I eat? Am I going to have haystacks or...
Not on a Sunday.
Veggie burger?
Yeah. Yeah, I think in principle form, I think the answer to that is yes. But in terms of a plan, like, does God have sort of a defined route laid out, and then he can either choose that route or not? I don't necessarily think that that's the way God works. I mean, in my humble opinion, I don't necessarily think it's a predetermined plan in terms of individuals' lives to that level of specificity, whether or not they're going to eat a veggie burger or haystacks. However, I do believe that God has a will.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not just our will, but God has a will. God has things that he wants to accomplish. Yeah. But, and this is where this relational element comes in, and really the word love comes in. If it's a loving relationship, God is not forcing that will. Okay? So that becomes an essential attribute of open theism, is that God is by definition not tyrannical. He's not one that enforces his will.
So this follows out of like the Wesleyan tradition then fairly strongly, I would expect.
Yeah, I think the reason there are many of us in the Adventist fold that are really intrigued by this concept, is because of our Wesleyan roots and some of these other roots that are there. There's a whole nother, chapter to this and a whole other layer to this discussion that I alluded to a little bit earlier on the question of theodicy, right? Pain, suffering, and evil, and how does that all work in light of a loving God?
I think I might have stumbled on this concept then when I was talking with somebody about the concept of judgment and the theodicy question, and I basically presented the idea of the great controversy, and then the idea that there's going to be a judgment at the end, not only of us but also of God's role. Mm-hmm. And the person I was talking with said, well, if God can be held accountable, what does that mean? And I was like, well, I guess that means that God has to exist in time.
Yeah.
If God can be held accountable, that seems to imply a lot of the same things that you're saying.
Yeah, accountability by definition, again, back to this theory of being in relationship, accountability by definition is being in the kind of relationship where one understands that there are expectations, and that I have invited you to hold me accountable based on these communal expectations of each other's behaviors, etc. It becomes a bad case of accountability when it turns into judgment. And judgment, and I tell this to my church members all the time, this is another way where open theism and relational theism, etc., really helps in a practical sense, is I said there's a big difference between judgment and accountability. Judgment is you holding somebody to a standard of activity or thinking or whatever without having been in a genuine relationship with them where they have invited you into a relationship of accountability, where you just sort of place yourself, you thrust yourself onto somebody and you say, you shouldn't be doing that, is very different than my wife saying to me, Steve, I noticed that you lingered a little too long at your glance at that girl. Why is that not judgment? If you guys said that to me, I'd be like, what do you know who I was looking at, what I was thinking? That judgment, it's somewhat prejudicial and you're not totally sure. But my wife, who knows me, whom I've invited into relationship with me, whom I've invited into a relationship of accountability with me, if she says it, well, that's not judgment, that's accountability. That's like, hey, think about this. So, this is a way in which open relational love theologies sort of work different from the traditional notion that God is ultimately completely sovereign, right?
Yeah. I like that. I like the explanation, so thanks. We'll keep going with this.
Well,
I guess what I was gonna say, I guess this is sort of my thinking through a lot of this. I appreciate Greg Boyd's statement that it's not about EDF, it's about this relationship with God, and you've emphasized that a lot, because that's how I'd encountered it originally. Is I'd get people and they're like, well, God doesn't know everything. He can't know everything because then we're not free. And I find that a really trite argument and grounded in some really weird assumptions and stuff. But yours, I'm like, for me, it ties to my thesis. I don't know if you've listened to the podcast where I talked about that. But for me, the idea that God is vulnerable is how I put it. And it's so central, the idea, that when God enters relationship with us, engages with us, God is actually risking something. God actually has something to lose. God can be hurt by us. And I mean, you take this to the incarnation, where God actually becomes human, is fundamentally changed for all of eternity by engaging us. Like, if that doesn't point in this direction, I don't know what does. Yeah. And then it opens up, I talk about the contest, and there's the idea that there are wills at play. You mentioned God's will, and that God's will isn't everything. God has a will, and he's telling one story, and we're telling sometimes a different one. And there's this really interesting interplay with that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the classical biblical examples of this, of God's will being thwarted, or God's will being, subject to other wills, is in Daniel chapter 10, where Daniel's praying for help, and the angel arrives and he says, listen, 3 weeks ago we heard your prayer. Listen, Daniel, we really meant to be here. But the prince of Persia, which, is code language perhaps for another angelic realm, perhaps the demonic realm. I mean, that's other biblical studies out there. But it says that the prince of Persia held me up. So this is God. It's like, were you trying to tell me there wasn't another angel you could send, God? Like, how does this work? How does the prince of Persia hold you up? Like, really, this was the only way for this to happen? And it's just this example of how God's will can be not actuated in the way he had anticipated or had intended for it to happen. And we use, like a lot of, and I don't know where I'm at right now completely on this notion, but there's a lot of texts in the Bible like God repented. Well, how do you repent if you have an ultimate will that's never thwarted and you're completely sovereign? I mean, even in the Genesis account of the flood, it uses the words, that God was grieved and God repented. And, to me, this is not the kind of God that we have painted. This God that is completely aloof and distant and unable to be impacted by the way in which we as humans decide to live out that freedom that we've been granted.
It's my understanding if God were completely aloof, completely independent of the lives which we live and our decisions, then his will would, by nature, be in a position. I mean, anything that he asked us to do would not be a relational request.
Yeah, it would be a power. It would be
a power over relationship.
That's right.
Rather than be what it is, as we understand it, an attempt to explain his character to us within the context of a relationship so that we can, be more like him, but I don't know. Yeah,
well, it begs the question then, why is there a Bible? If God's out there distant, he doesn't need to reveal himself to us because we're going to do whatever he wants anyways. You don't talk to your computer and say, okay, computer, I'm here today. My name is David. I want you. Let's work together today. And I want you to do this for me. Like, no. Yeah. You just push the buttons and it does what you want. If it doesn't, you fix it or get somebody who can.
Yeah. So let me give you some more practical examples of how this imposition, works in people's psyches. Okay, so person X is a 25-year-old woman, who from the ages of 3 to 8 was sexually molested by somebody who had access to her, some creepy uncle or some terrible teacher or whatever. She's now hidden that away in her psyche for, the last decade and a half, and she's a young adult, and she's getting into these relationships with men and realizing that she's very destructive and that these relationships always fail because she's having a really hard time trusting. So she finally goes to see a Christian counselor. And she finally opens up. She says, from 3 to 8, I was sexually molested. I'm having a really hard time, being in a relationship with another individual. And the Christian counselor says something crazy like, Well, what can you learn from that experience, because God's got a lesson in that for you. And there's this underlying thing that whatever you go through, that cancer that's in your body right now, well, that was part of God's blueprint. And Dale, you've got something to learn from that, or that automobile accident, there's a lesson in that because that was obviously part of God's will. Or you hear it a lot when people die, and they die unexpectedly. And they say something like, I guess it was his time.
Yeah.
Like, as though something is completely predetermined on some chronological timeline that everybody knows exactly when they're going to go, and that God's got it all worked out. By that definition, my friend Manuel Silva, who passed away 3 weeks ago, God had it in his plan, or at least allowed for it and knew of this all, that he was going to, get cancer, have a 15-month battle, and die a terrible death at 46 years of age, leaving behind a wife and children. And somehow, now his kids are supposed to learn this lesson from that, God has taken away your dad prematurely and taken away your husband prematurely, and there's a lesson in all of this for you because, this was part of God's will. And so this is very, very destructive when a child has been told that everything that happens is part of God's will. Everything. We quote Romans 8:28. And all things, we think, work together for good to those that... And we somehow think that all things means that God has put all these things. But what it's really saying is that God works good out of all things because he's a loving God. So something terrible happens. Does God want a better outcome out of that? Of course he does. Does he want to try and take this terrible situation and make the best of it? Of course he does. But does he use these terrible situations as part of his divine will and plan to somehow teach us something? Well, that to me is more like a terrorist than a God. Somebody with a twisted notion of teaching,
Yeah, the ends justify the means.
Yeah, exactly.
The catch is that's what the Pharisees said. Better that one man should die than the whole nation should be ruined. And well, that was the God they were serving, but it's not the God that Christ was.
Yeah.
And,
So let's take prayer. For me, what really clinched it, like when I was finally willing to kind of go out and say, I'm an open theist because it just makes more sense. Take prayer, for example, and take prayer of intervention. And the intelligibility, we have situation A, God is open to these prayers and to wills being given over to his will. Like we say, thy will be done, I'm giving over my will to you. Why do we do that? Why is that necessary? Why is that? Well, it's necessary because God's a gentleman, because God is loving. God's in a genuine covenant relationship, and he's not just going to step on your toes and run amok with you. He's not just about forcing his way. And so when we say, I don't want it to be my will, your will be done, we're actually in a genuine give and take relationship at that point where we're saying, we don't know this to the depth and to the degree and to the breadth that you know it. And we may stumble over some of our actions. And so what we're doing is we're inviting you to have an actual role in this. And the more people that pray this prayer, the more wills that are being let go, the less God has to be worried about how his intervention may or may not affect the outcome of things. And this is very important if, in fact, God is on trial. If this great controversy narrative is important, if God has been accused of something, and that this accusation was that God is actually not really loving and not really giving us freedom and not really all of these things, then the whole open picture makes a lot of that make sense. To me, anyways. It has an explanatory scope that the traditional classical notions of God don't.
I agree. I like that. I'll give you a sec to think. I got lots to say, so
Go for it.
Well, thanks. I'm wondering if we can talk a bit more about go back to the relationship idea, because what I was thinking about that is there's a sense where you can distinguish. In some ways, we're in relationship to everything around us, and everybody around us, and there's fundamental differences in those relationships, though. We've sort of gone through this. And I guess what I'm thinking, three rough differences. You have a relationship with your computer, again, where you push the buttons, it does things. And you have nothing really at risk in that. Yes, the computer crashes, you could lose your paper, but that's pretty much your own fault because you didn't save it. It's not the computer's fault. you have a relationship with your dog, and then we get into classical Pavlovian conditioning and things where you do that. You train your dog to do certain things, but there's again not quite the same level of engagement and will. But then you enter into a relationship with a person, and yes, this can be twisted in really terrible ways, and our earthly history is full of that. But really, the strong human relationships are about that give and take. I mean, and this is in my thesis. It was really interesting. In the sacrament, he talks about this as communion, in the liturgical sense of ingesting part of the other, and in that sense that you are what you eat, and so you eat the other, and the other eats you, and that's what it means to be in a relationship. And it can be gruesome, but I find that a very powerful image for what happens, that you lose something by being in a relationship to someone else, but you also gain something. And it's that exchange, that really visceral bodily exchange that is so powerful in a relationship. And I love that idea that's what God is. I mean, I'm beginning to think a lot lately about God with us, and I think Open Theism is running down this and has been doing so for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the incarnation, I call it the great empathetic act.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like we always talk about, how do we learn to be empathetic? How and it's often impossible. It's often impossible to really walk a day in the life of somebody else and in their shoes, etc. But we do our best, right, to try and understand, and we can really sense when somebody becomes empathetic. Well, you just look at the incarnation, God with us, right? This idea that God wanted to understand us to such depths that he was willing to genuinely become like us. For me, it's one of the things that sets apart a Christian theistic perspective, from other theistic perspectives. God was not afraid of us. God was not afraid of getting involved in risky business. God was willing to risk love. I mean, the whole story of evil and why there's a fall and why there's if we take these, stories as having any meaning, semblance of truth, that some creature in heaven that was created perfect was actually able to exert another will. Somehow we all think that how does that happen in a perfect world? Well, it's only if that perfect world is defined by the classical notions of God sort of controlling things and not having that. But if God actually created a relational world with genuine wills and irrevocable freedom, then it's not so far-fetched that perhaps somebody could exert that will because they too are growing and learning and real beings, okay? And so for me as an Adventist, I found this idea of open theism really completed the picture for me. Mm-hmm. A lot of the loose ends, not that I don't have loose ends now, I do, especially when it comes to, and perhaps that's the thing we won't have the time to touch, but how do you fit this open picture and being able to thwart wills to this prophetic timeline kind of centerpiece in so much of Adventist thinking? In the predictive prophecy component of what makes so many Adventists. Look at how history laid out, and the Bible tells us that was what's going to happen. And that's why I think we're so keen on dates, and we don't want anybody to steal any of our dates from us, because there's a level of certainty that people crave. So I have this whole element of my Adventism that was rendered far more intelligible and was like a breath of fresh air, and I was like, this all, so much more helpful now in my thinking. But then there was this other component that was I will have to wrestle with that one, won't I? And in all honesty, I'm still wrestling with it to some degree. But
one place that I think the place you might want to go to look for the answer for that would be looking at what free will is.
Yeah.
And the limits of free will. And kind of a strange, but okay.
This is another podcast we need to
do. Straight up, just looking at the philosophical research into free will, psychological.
Yeah, I've heard all those things.
There's been some really in-depth, wrestling between the concept of determinism and
I've done a lot of reading on that.
I mean, I think it does give you
food for thought, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I get it. However, I guess just call me pragmatic. I make decisions all the time. And I know the theory is that your circumstances and your upbringing and every situation, I know I can't make every decision. I can't fly out this window. I know. Like, I know that there are things that are limiting the kinds of choices I make, etc. But in the end, I think if you pushed it and you told people and you just said, listen, free will is a figment of your imagination, and you really push that,
it wouldn't have a positive impact?
It would have a very terrible impact. Yeah, it would have a very terrible impact. And I think a lot of people, I think it would open up doors for research. And I think a lot of people would push back. I think a lot of people would push back and say, well, there's other theories out there. And there are people pushing back. There's lots.
We need to do a podcast on that. I've got some ideas already, and I should post up, actually, maybe on the website, a link I ran across the other day talking about consciousness, which I think is very relevant. We only got a few minutes left. I'm wondering if you can give us a quick synopsis. I should have asked this sooner. Sort of your story, like how did you get into this, and why does it mean so much to you? And you've sort of touched on that. I'm wondering if there's like a smaller story you can tell that about the personal connection for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, really, being thrust as a 23-year-old pastor into a 2-church district and actually meeting real people, kind of getting out of the ivory tower of college and actually, rubber meets the road Christianity and genuine people and their stories and what they're going through. It just, I was at a sort of a crisis point in light of, how does this work? How do you actually enter into a relationship with these people that you are trying to disciple? You're trying to get them into, trying to get them to follow Jesus and whatnot. And so I just got thinking about that relationship in my own life, which got me thinking about, how does God go about all this, and what is my relationship like with and it was just I just kept going. I just kept peeling back the layers of the onion and realizing that there was a lot more here, So for me, it was just a methodological, how am I going to be an effective evangelist? Like how am I actually going to, and then I realized, man, there's just so much here to how this all works, and there's a lot more than meets the eye. It's not so straightforward.
So I guess really, I like that. Pretty much it was you trying to relate to people. You need to find a God that related to you in a way that worked with people.
Yeah.
So your theology, I guess, in some ways became really practical.
Yeah. And to be honest, the biggest reason I'm an open theist is it passes the real life test. Like, all of us live life as though freedom were real. All of us pray as though freedom is real. All of us, avoid accidents on the road. Like, I better stop creeping this way, or I better stop at this stop. Like, we all live as though consequences were real and our actions had genuine impacts in this world. We all live that way. And then my theology just sort of followed suit and said, this makes sense. And then, of course, I studied through the Bible and I said, well,
and God says he's like us, or we're like him, so why shouldn't God also live in such a universe?
I guess at the bedrock level. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks a lot for sharing with us. That was it was really interesting. If you have anything to say in close.
No, I think that's pretty much all I have to say.
Okay, sweet. Well, thanks for listening. If you found this online somewhere, our website is tanshi.blogspot.ca. That's TAANSHI.blogspot.ca, or you can find us on Facebook at the Soaring Life Group.